In 5 days, Assassin's Creed Black Flag Resynced launches, a comprehensive ground-up remake of one of Ubisoft's most enduringly cherished titles, restoring players to the swashbuckling odyssey of Edward Kenway aboard the Jackdaw amid the sun-drenched Caribbean, where ship-to-ship broadsides, buried treasure, and the intoxicating pirate fantasy still evoke the last chapter in which Ubisoft felt universally admired rather than cautiously tolerated. Yet, this release does not land as uncomplicated nostalgia. It arrives at the nadir of Ubisoft's most protracted financial and reputational reckoning in memory, transforming what might otherwise have been a straightforward celebratory return into something considerably more consequential. This is Ubisoft's biggest test in years. Black Flag Resynced might truly represent the final clean chance for the Ubisoft of old to demonstrate that it can still redeem the Ubisoft of today. Following a prolonged period of financial contraction, unsustainable production scale, misguided pursuit of fleeting trends, an over-reliance on live service architecture, and deepening estrangement from its core audience, the publisher has elected to retrace its steps to one of its least contested assets. And that strategic retreat alone reveals the gravity of the moment. The question is no longer merely whether the remake will prove visually arresting or mechanically competent. It is whether Ubisoft can at last translate one of its most potent remaining reservoirs of cultural equity into tangible revenue, renewed investor confidence, and irrefutable evidence that the steward of these storied properties still possesses the discernment and discipline required to honor them. The financial picture is devastating in its scale and persistence. In the year ending March 2026, Ubisoft lost more than 1.3 billion euros, a record-shattering figure that left the company bleeding cash at an almost unimaginable rate, while sales fell sharply, and the company warned that the pain would continue, with hundreds of millions more expected to disappear in cash burn and no genuine return to profit anywhere on the horizon until at least 2028. Reuters described Black Flag Resynced bluntly as the gamble meant to turn its ship around, while analyst Corentin Marty warned that Ubisoft can't afford to disappoint here. Morningstar delivered an even harsher verdict, declaring the company has no competitive moat and carries extreme uncertainty, though it grudgingly conceded the franchises might still hold some hidden value after the collapse. Barclays captured the prevailing investor skepticism with clinical precision. The market will only believe the promised recovery when it is in front of them. Promises, strategic pivots, and transformation narratives have lost their currency. What is required now is delivered proof, and Black Flag Resynced has been positioned to furnish it. Perhaps the most telling statistic lies not in the headline loss itself, but in the revelation that back catalog sales already constitute the overwhelming share of net bookings. This dependence underscores a sobering reality. Ubisoft has become structurally reliant on yesterday's successes and yesterday's goodwill merely to sustain operations. Liquidity remains, and outright insolvency is not imminent. Yet the combination of refinancing obligations, persistent cash burn, restructuring expenditures, and a profound credibility deficit with both capital markets and consumers has sharply constricted the margin for error. The investment community continues to recognize the latent worth embedded in Ubisoft's portfolio. Assassin's Creed, Far Cry, Rainbow Six, Splinter Cell, Prince of Persia, Rayman, Ghost Recon, The Division. Yet it withholds confidence in the operator's capacity to steward those assets without eroding their intrinsic appeal. The brands retain their luster. The steward no longer commands trust. That fundamental dissonance is what elevates this particular remake beyond ordinary catalog revival. Even the Assassin's Creed franchise, historically the company's most reliable financial bulwark, illuminates the systemic nature of the malaise rather than alleviating it. Shadows delivered incremental quarterly outperformance, supported certain internal targets, and sustained robust active player engagement with competitive launch metrics. Nevertheless, the broader apparatus continued to generate record deficits, aggressive portfolio rationalization through cancellations and delays, workforce adjustments, and the disquieting realization that isolated flagship success can no longer conceal entrenched inefficiencies in cost structure, execution consistency, and audience rapport. In partial response, Ubisoft established Vantage Studios as a semi-autonomous creative house, incorporating Tencent participation, conferring dedicated oversight and operational independence upon Assassin's Creed, Far Cry, and Rainbow Six. Black Flag Resynced occupies the very heart of this recalibration, the most disciplined, lowest-risk manifestation of a renewed emphasis on proven properties. Ubisoft's own forward-looking disclosures for the forthcoming fiscal cycle speak explicitly of targeted premium games based on established Ubisoft brands, corporate vernacular that translates plainly to a deliberate pivot towards safer intellectual property and nostalgia-driven economics. In unvarnished terms, Ubisoft has grown increasingly dependent upon yesterday's franchises, yesterday's affection, and yesterday's accumulated prestige. Black Flag Resynced embodies that dependence in its purest form. The path that delivered Ubisoft to this juncture comprises 4 mutually reinforcing failures in approach and execution. The first was a fundamental shift in its business philosophy and economic model. The publisher gradually assumed the posture of a managerial platform enterprise that incidentally produced games, rather than a creative enterprise whose foremost obligation was the cultivation of immersive worlds and resonant player experiences. Every design decision slowly became entangled in an ever-thickening web of overlapping systems that prioritized retention, monetization, and ecosystem glue over pure adventure and player delight. Ubisoft's most distinctive and damaging contribution to modern gaming was its aggressive normalization of microtransactions, real-money cosmetic stores, season passes, and deluxe edition bloat directly inside what were marketed as complete single-player adventures, effectively turning even solo campaigns into ongoing revenue platforms rather than finished experiences. The second wound was tonal. During the Ubisoft Quartz NFT initiative, executive Nicolas Poire publicly suggested that gamers simply did not understand the prospective virtues of digital secondary markets and player reselling mechanisms, portraying dissent as intellectual shortfall rather than principled refusal to commodify leisure into speculative instruments. That condescending register reverberated across subsequent defenses of unpopular directions, cementing the impression that Ubisoft regarded its foundational community as an impediment rather than the bedrock that had preserved its most valuable properties. The third was creative and cultural. For years, the company pursued hypothetical expansion demographics and institutional objectives, while the dedicated audience that had sustained these series through lean periods sensed progressive marginalization. The consequence was formulaic inflation, environmental exhaustion, and a climate in which routine decisions invited immediate suspicion because residual goodwill had been exhausted. The Assassin's Creed Shadows launch laid this bare. By choosing a protagonist whose historical footprint in feudal Japan was minimal for a setting fans had requested for years, Ubisoft triggered the widespread perception that modern representational priorities had once again overridden the simple desire for an immersive Japanese fantasy drawn from the rich abundance of authentic historical and legendary figures readily available. The fourth concerned operational discipline. An overextended portfolio, habitual schedule slippage, escalating development expenditures, recurrent project terminations, studio realignments, and a utilization-focused ethos that occasionally privileged workforce occupancy over cohesive, high-caliber delivery, produced a succession of costly disappointments, a thinned release cadence, and the imperative for sweeping corrective measures that have characterized recent fiscal cycles. These deficiencies did not operate independently. Their convergence forged an entity that appeared progressively alienated from both the players and the creative ethos that had once distinguished it. Black Flag Resynced, therefore, constitutes an exceptionally well-calibrated rescue mechanism, enabling Ubisoft to harness nostalgia, demonstrated demand, the favorable economics of remakes, and internal capability redeployment in a single stroke. It ranks among the least contested assets in the entire library, widely recalled as the final Ubisoft production that delivered unalloyed adventure rather than obligation. It serves as explicit corrective to Skull and Bones, the initiative conceived in 2013 as a naval multiplayer adjunct to the original Black Flag, which evolved through successive reinventions, including a phase designated Black Flag Infinite, underwent setting and genre transformations, devoured a decade and substantial capital under Ubisoft Singapore, and debuted in 2024 to broad disillusionment precisely because it isolated the maritime components while jettisoning Edward, the Assassin Order, the archipelago exploration, boarding sequences, and the integrated narrative that audiences had always prized. The studio that expended years attempting to transcend Black Flag now finds itself redirected to resurrect it, an exercise that functions simultaneously as salvage of expensively acquired naval simulation expertise and implicit recognition that the encompassing fantasy proved more compelling than the deconstructed variant. By adopting this course, Ubisoft consciously emulates the Capcom paradigm that has established the contemporary standard for heritage resuscitation. Capcom transformed its Resident Evil remakes into a self-reinforcing cycle of credibility restoration and catalog longevity by revering source material, applying measured modernization, pricing experiences as premium offerings, and leveraging renewed faith to underwrite measured original follow-ups, all executed with evident assurance and strategic clarity. Reuters explicitly invoked the comparison in its coverage of Black Flag Resynced. The distinction, however, remains instructive. Capcom's approach projects institutional strength and forward momentum. Ubisoft's conveys exigency born of depleted alternatives. That postural contrast clarifies why triumph in this instance would carry genuine significance, while shortfall would prove especially damaging. We have not yet experienced the complete title, and that limitation requires acknowledgement. Promotional materials and available previews indicate a faithful reconstruction led primarily by Ubisoft Singapore on the latest iteration of the Anvil engine, incorporating meaningful advancements in combat responsiveness, stealth flexibility, parkour fluidity, naval dynamics, supplemental narrative content, and quality-of-life refinements, alongside the participation of veteran developers and voice talent. The appropriate pre-release evaluative framework is therefore exacting, yet equitable. Will the combat register as viscerally satisfying in the current generation without descending into formulaic action? Will stealth reward acuity and environmental mastery rather than rote progression markers? Will the world continue to inspire organic exploration instead of checklist navigation? Will the expanded narrative threads enrich Edward's arc without compromising pacing? Above all, will the finished product safeguard the distinctive cadence and liberating fantasy that elevated the original, the sensation of charting one's own course beneath open skies? Or will it encase that essence within the familiar connective scaffolding, reward transference from Shadows through the Black Tides update, Animus Hub initiatives, and cross-title incentives that have rendered recent entries more akin to transit nodes than autonomous experiences? The pivotal uncertainty is whether Ubisoft can emulate Capcom's restraint while suppressing its ingrained platform reflexes, or whether venerable cultural holdings are merely being refurbished with contemporary corporate apparatus. The implications transcend Ubisoft because the broader AAA sector contends with parallel structural pressures: prohibitive development inflation, heightened peril surrounding original concepts, saturated live service arenas, dispersed consumer attention, and the dawning recognition that nostalgia itself has emerged as one of the few dependable ledger assets remaining. When executed with integrity, remakes can stabilize liquidity, revitalize catalog longevity, and secure runway for more balanced future development. Should Black Flag Resynced fulfill its promise by demonstrably internalizing audience feedback, restoring the unadulterated adventure long requested, it would affirm that reverence for heritage, paired with disciplined modernization, can function as a credible pathway to renewed relevance, potentially modeling constructive conduct industry-wide. Black Flag Resynced registers as Ubisoft extending itself back toward gamers through the medium of the work itself, rather than pronouncements. Following the NFT interlude, the live service detours, the inability of Skull and Bones to supplant the original appeal, and years spent suggesting audiences failed to grasp the impending direction, the decisive maneuver is retracing steps to one of the most unequivocal demonstrations of what those audiences had cherished in unaltered form. That choice itself intimates recognition that perhaps the audience was not misguided. Perhaps it perceived with clarity that games ought to prioritize experiential integrity above all. Perhaps the miscalculation resided in presuming organizational frameworks and hypothetical demographics outweighed the imperative of furnishing delight to those who had sustained the enterprise across decades. If Ubisoft can deliver a confident, reverent, exhilarating remake, one that preserves the Black Flag people remember, while still feeling worthy of a modern AAA open-world game in 2026, without the usual Ubisoft bloat, messaging, or ecosystem baggage, then Resynced may genuinely mark the beginning of a more serious recovery. But if even this most insulated of legacies cannot escape the patterns that produced Ubisoft's present crisis, then the conclusion becomes far more severe. Because if Ubisoft cannot be trusted with the very games that once defined its appeal, then what exactly remains for players to believe in? That is the referendum presently approaching the horizon, and the entire industry, together with every gamer who once raised the Black Flag in unreserved delight, will be observing the outcome with keen anticipation.